Well, good morning to all of you. This is what I have called Getting to 66, and I begin with a warning from a great recent Methodist preacher who grew up in North Georgia, and he said, you can get an A in Bible, but you can still flunk Christianity. And that indeed is what you're going to see happen here. You're going to see how the Bible was created, and then there was Christianity. So, this is a wild ride. For some of you, maybe half of you, this will be at times troubling. Why did they do it like that? That doesn't make any sense. And it really undermines my sense of what I thought the Bible was all about. The Bible came together in ways that no one, literally no one except maybe God, could fully understand because it was wild and woolly, didn't follow any pattern, and just kind of happened. So, let's start there. One of the sheets that was back on the table is just a copy of the contents of the Bible, the 66 books. As I mentioned in the e-news this week, if some of you read that, I want you to go look at this list, and of the ones in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament as we traditionally call it, I want you to pick out your 3 favorites. And then likewise, pick out your 3 favorites for the New Testament. I'll give you a minute to do that, but only a minute, so this will be kind of your own first impression. Now, let's say that somebody outside of you, like somebody who sees themselves as being more important and knowing more than you do, tells you that you're only allowed to have 1 Old Testament book and 1 New Testament book. Make your decision.
This is me.
And the second thing I want to do is ask you to write down, as far as you're concerned, what are the 1 or 2 things about the Christian faith that are just most important to you. You couldn't do without them. They're, in your mind, what allow you to say, I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of Christ. A couple of things, and we're not going to give you any limits here, but for the sake of time, let's just take a minute or 2 to do that, because you'll get to trace those as we go through this class about, are they in the Bible, are they not in the Bible, why are they in the Bible, why are they not in the Bible? Take a minute. Now I want to read 2 short passages from a book just published by Elaine Pagels. Elaine Pagels has for 40 years been a professor at Princeton Seminary and is considered one of the American leaders in understanding the Bible. This is her effort at age 80 to sum up the Bible of what she thinks she's learned in all her years. And in one chapter, she talks about a friend of hers, Nathaniel Lerman, who has gone around the country and interviewed people about, well, this very question that I just asked you, what is it that the Christian faith is all about? And I want to read you two very different descriptions of what people say. The first one is when this fellow went to the Association of Vineyard Churches in California. You may have heard of the Vineyard Churches. It's kind of a modern denomination. And he writes this: Vineyard Christians invite people to encounter Jesus as their closest friend. Members think of God as someone who interacts with them as if it was their friend. He speaks to them. He listens to them. They have talks with God. God becomes real. And he questions, how do experiences of talking with God or with Jesus differ from insanity, in which mentally unbalanced people interact with invisible spirits? Members of the Vineyard tend to say that Jesus is someone who, having been human himself, has experienced everything we experience, yet who, also being God, can meet all of our needs. The other one is a time when this professor was in the hills of Arkansas, and he was worshiping with some AME Christians, African Methodist Christians, in a radically different setting than the one I just read about California. These members picture themselves as being part of God's own family. They see Jesus as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. When many of them were younger, they were terrified to hear of the lynching of Emmett Till. Deprived of any effective path to justice, my people, says the leader of the congregation, hearing of this event, would immediately gather here in this congregation, grieving, crying, and singing of Jesus. For them, a deeply human yet divinely powerful ally. That's what God was. For these Christians, they see themselves as sharing Jesus' suffering. They focus on Jesus' arrest, torture, and his unjust death, confident that he would understand the suffering of one of their own and their own devastating grief. Two very different pictures of what people say Christianity is. So we're going to begin a tour of how we got to 27 books in the New Testament. We're going to also be talking about something kind of that interweaves in all of this, and that is we really have two stories going here. One is the story of Jesus, the historical person that various ancient texts have claimed lived and walked in Galilee, the Jesus of history. And then we're also going to talk about something that is really pretty important for all of us, and that is the Christ of theology. The Christ that comes out and kind of weaves its way through this Jesus of history. But first we'll deal with the Jesus of history. If you get out the handout that says timeline, remember that all of the books in the New Testament, not a single one of them, except for the book of Revelation, was ever written with the thought that it would be part of Scripture. And not a single one of them was written within a generation of Jesus' lifetime. Jesus died in roughly the year 30. The first gospel was found, discovered, used in the year 70. 40 years before the first book in the Bible even arrived. And it didn't arrive as a book in the Bible. It arrived by someone who wrote it. Probably it arrived in Rome, of all places, not in the Holy Land. And it arrived as some comfort for a local congregation, probably a group of Christians in Rome. It was probably written by one of their members to help guide them as to what were some of the truths, what were some of the facts of this Jesus who lived long before their lifetimes. So a Jesus whom none of them knew and did not know anybody who knew Jesus. That's the year 70, but we'll get to that in a minute. First of all, let's go through a few things before we get to this gospel. Jesus dies, and the disciples struggle to sort out, what does that mean? Is it over? Is there nothing more? Because for the most part, the disciples and the apostles of Jesus' time had a firm belief that the end was near. It would happen in their lifetimes. And so all of that kind of just presumption about what Jesus is all about has now been kind of smashed. Jesus has not been around for 2 or 3 generations, and there are fewer and fewer people that knew somebody who knew somebody that knew Jesus. So we get to a period of time in which the disciples are kind of confounded. Give or take 5 years after Jesus' death, Stephen was stoned. Stephen, claiming to be a young follower of this Jesus, was stoned, and who was there at the stoning? A fellow named Saul. Yeah. Saul was a Pharisee. He thought of Jesus as a problem and his followers as kind of traitors to the Hebrew faith. These Christians were trying to turn Judaism into something that the strong and, would you say, almost rigid believers in Judaism felt was heresy. These followers of Jesus were engaged in heresy and they needed to be stopped. And so Stephen got stoned by those who found Christians to be unacceptable. And so the story goes, it was Saul who held the coats of those who stoned Stephen. Now we get to a point where we have to say, these are stories. You have to sort of engage them as potentially so, and perhaps exaggerations of what went on, or perhaps even made up. So we get to the year 35, Stephen is stoned, Paul is there. If somebody could pass me one of the timelines, I want to make sure I don't miss anything, because I got more on my timeline than I got in my notes. So we go on. Oh, thanks, I got one from my wife, yeah. Thanks. We go on, and about 5 years after Stephen's stoning, the apostles realized that this isn't going to happen unless they do something. So a decade after what we think is Jesus' death, the disciples start to declare they are going to evangelize. And the first one that we know about is Philip, who chooses Samaria. Samaria in the Bible, 2 stories we all know, the Samaritan woman at the well and the Good Samaritan on the road. So Philip chooses Samaria, and some of the other disciples are choosing their way. But also what is going on is that the church in Jerusalem, or the believers in Jerusalem, have decided on the leaders of that group, that house church. One is to be James, Jesus' brother. And the other is to be Peter, although Peter won't be there for long. So finally we get to the year 50 when things start to percolate along. Saul has his vision in which he sees various things kind of pertinent to his own history. and he changes his name to Paul, and he begins his missionary work, not in the Holy Land, but outside. One of the things that was true in this time is the world, the known world in the Middle East, was basically unified by what had happened with the Greeks hundreds of years before. This was what we called the Hellenistic world, and within that we have, little bitty Israel and a few other countries. But what united the world was everybody spoke Greek. And so Paul makes the decision to go with the Greek-speaking part of the world, far away from Jerusalem, but finding little places where there are Christians who have gathered, and Paul begins his missionary journeys. And you can see the map that I provided you, the 3 journeys that Paul makes. And notice, they're all pretty far from Jerusalem. Meantime, Peter, who was kind of seen as the head of the church in Jerusalem, decides to act as a missionary beyond the Jews. This is a pretty big deal, because it was presumed that who would become Christians? It was Jews. After all, it was Jews who Jesus worked with, who Jesus was friends, family with. This was the traditions. Jesus spoke Aramaic. Jesus did not speak Greek. He wasn't part of this wider world. But Paul and then Peter choose to move out into the wider world. And so before we even have anything that you and I would call a church, a religious faith, we have folks going to places beyond their home, outside of their home base. And this becomes something of an issue because the folks in the home base kind of feel like they're the ones that began it. They're the original ones who were there. They're the ones who were following along with the way they thought this faith should evolve. And what's happening, but the churches seem to be springing up way, way beyond. There's this moment when Paul, in the book of Acts, where the writer of the book of Acts talks about how Paul went to these Hellenistic Christian churches and he gathered money to take as a tribute, as a donation to the church at Jerusalem, because the church at Jerusalem wasn't doing very well. And if you recall the story in Acts, Paul gets there, hands over the money, and immediately they have a fight. Because the way Paul is seeing the world and the church evolve is very different than the way the church is set and functioning at home, in the home territory, if you will. So then we come to the year 60, and the churches in the Hellenistic world have now become pretty established. They have kind of a bit of leadership. They've elected people to lead them. They're even starting to think about what does it take to run an organization. We just don't have folks here that are believers, but we have to figure out how they can get along with each other, how they will organize and rule each other. And so at Antioch in Syria, we have perhaps what is the largest church. And also at Antioch in Syria, they become the most organized church. They become the church with the clearest notion of what it means to be Christian. And so the word Christian is said there. This is the first time that these followers of Jesus now have a name. And the name is no longer followers of Jesus, but it is Christian. And here we have the encounter of Jesus versus Christ. These aren't Jesus people, these are Christians. And so begins that story that I said earlier, weaves between the history of Jesus and the theology of Christ, because what's going on in Antioch is these churches have both Jews and non-Jews in them. Prior to this, the churches were either Jewish or the members were not Jewish. But now we have the first real amalgamation in which we've kind of gone beyond the Holy Land. And now we are further out in the world, and it's only the year 60. We're, 30 years when Christ was crucified. And then we get to the wider world in terms of what was going on with Rome. In the year 64, the city of Rome almost burned down. Most of Rome was destroyed, and the emperor was Nero. Nero, who fiddled while Rome burned. Remember that from your history. And Nero needed a scapegoat. And guess who he picked for scapegoats? Any Christians he could find. And he would bring them up, put them in the Colosseum, and have them killed. And so two famous Christians that Nero killed were Paul and Peter. Peter supposedly crucified upside down because he claimed he wasn't worthy to be crucified like his Lord. And Paul, who was crucified as a Roman, and that was the death wasn't nearly so terrible. They just beheaded him. So the Roman custom was to behead good Romans, but Christians had to suffer, so they had to be crucified. So here we are at 65. They're both killed. And then the year 70, probably one of the great turning points in Christian history. In the year 70, the Romans sacked Jerusalem. They knocked down the temple. They sent the Jews fleeing in the city. They murdered as many as they could. And so any congregation that was established in Jerusalem was pretty much snuffed out. It was pushed out to the countryside. The Romans were on a rampage for a number of years, and so Christians in the Holy Land were highly endangered. They went into hiding, they went underground, if you will. And so it meant that the church now growing was growing outside of its original locations. Keep in mind that at this point, the church has very little leadership. If you're a member of a group of Christians, the way your church operates, the way your group operates is more on a friendship basis. We all knew one another, or we invited a few people into our fellowship, and the way we choose right and wrong, what's true and not true, is just based on our own perspectives. We don't have any notion that a church here and a church maybe 8 miles walk away, that we operate the same way. We just don't. We don't at all. And so one of the great struggles in the church is going to be, how do we bring some unity to these churches? Well, one way certainly would be to have leadership and rules we all held in common. And another way would be to have writings that we all have in common. And so here we get the first gospel. The gospel later to become Mark, but only named Mark because some people thought that was a good name for it, written by somebody probably in Rome, but somebody who clearly had some set story, some set collection of things that have been passed around, stories and incidents that have been passed down, and so creates this first, what it amounts to is a kind of biography, doesn't it? It's the story of Jesus' life. It's a story that, as later some Christians would say, has no beginning and has no end. So the church goes for 20 years, some local congregations having access to Mark. But the church, as you can see, is over a large world. And this book written by Mark could not have circulated everywhere. How could that have happened? But other books were circulated. And so in each area of the world, there were writings that local churches became fond of. These were the things that they read and held in common. And so after a while, let's say once we get to the year 100, we don't have one writing, maybe we have 50, maybe we have 100. And some of them are these kind of biographies. There's the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas. There are Gospels everywhere. They're just kind of springing up because there is this need to have some stories in common. And of course, in this time, everything is handwritten, hand-copied. You know what it's like to copy 5,000 words? They don't always come out the same each time you copy them. And so the stories evolve. And as people have kind of notions of what it means to be Christian, as some one of them is copying the thing that was passed on to them, they alter it a little bit just so it fits, so it makes sense to them. And so we have maybe this thing of Mark, but there, I don't know, there's 100 versions of Mark, maybe, you know? And Mark has no beginning and no end. And the reason I say this is it troubled many that the Gospel of Mark begins, well, Mark's favorite word is immediately, begins bang, and he calls disciples, and he goes out and he does these things. But what about Jesus' birth? Where's that? Well, it's not there. And what about at the end in Mark? You know how Mark ends? I'll read you how Mark ends.
Very anticlimactic.
Very anticlimactic. One of the women go to the tomb, and the angel says, he goes before you into Galilee. He goes before you into Galilee. That's the end. So all of us who have been sort of taught by Luke and Matthew say, we need a better biography here. We really do. And so along about the year 90, we get Matthew. Matthew probably written in Antioch, but clearly Matthew written by someone who A, wanted a beginning and an ending, and B, wanted the writing to look very Jewish. And so we get Matthew. What happens at the beginning of Matthew? Well, we get these folks coming from out of the world. We get these magi, but where do they come? They come to Bethlehem, right? They come to this Jewish world. And then at the end, Matthew's worry is that the Jews will be criticized for crucifying Jesus. So who is the one that pulls the trigger? It's Pilate. It's not a Jew who says crucify him. It's Pilate who says that. And so now we have a second biography that clearly has a slant. We've given it a beginning and an end, and that's much tidier. And we've also got a gospel, a story of Jesus, that clearly is Jewish in its bones. And there's lots of references in this gospel to things that Jews do and things Jews don't do. And if you go back and look at parts of Matthew, you'll kind of see that. He brings out bad stuff about the Pharisees, but good stuff about other Jews. So we now have a kind of Jewish-like gospel, and then a few years later comes a third one, and it's Luke, and it also probably comes out of Antioch. And so it tells you something about how central Antioch was. These two gospels, not very different, but somewhat different. Luke's gospel is all about the Hellenistic world, all about the wider world and how this faith is now coming to the wider world. Luke, of course, is considered to be the one who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, and so this writer gets the kind of notoriety of having been a pretty good historian. And so in places where the Gospel of Luke was ascendant, it was pretty well liked and pretty well promoted. So now we're to the year 95 or 100, and then we get something we've never seen before. Then we get the Gospel of John, and it's nothing like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are about Jesus' ministry, about miracles, about healing, about challenges and Jesus' calling. John, no, it has some of that in there, but John's all about Jesus. And Jesus has been transformed. Jesus now is the Logos. He comes down from above. Jesus is now the one. Jesus doesn't perform miracles, but there are signs that point to Jesus and who he was. So it perhaps in one way is like a Broadway play about Jesus. It's all about him. Everything is about him. There are parts of it, he changes water into wine and he does things, but it's all about this person who's now probably as a result of the congregations that have formed. This writing is hearing from congregations and how various people have begun to picture Jesus beyond just that he did this and then he did that. Jesus is taking on now a sense of somebody that perhaps, as the Vineyard Christians would say, somebody we can know, he's like us. And so the Gospel of John is a sort of step ahead in terms of a change in the writings that we have. So let's pause here for a minute and talk about the other writings, the writings you've never seen and may see if you really want to work at the library. So we have these stories of Jesus, and we pretty much covered all the territory we need to cover. Although there are many other Gospels out there writing this differently. And one of the things we start to make a guess about that's out there is a document that scholars call Q, or Quelle. And Quelle means, any of you?
Quelle?
Yeah.
I'm talking about the filioque clause?
Yeah. So we have a writing, sort of, we don't know what to call it. It's a collection of little tiny stories and moments. And when we take Matthew and Luke, these two, capstones of the Jesus biography, when we take them, we start to notice, that in Matthew, 90% of Mark is there. In Luke, 40%, 50%. Luke wants to change things around because he wants to get the wider world in. That's Luke's goal. He wants to have this gospel be about Jesus, but about a wider world than just the Holy Land. And then when we look at Matthew and Luke side by side, by golly, they have the same stories almost word for word, as if they had cheated on the other one's test. And we start to say, how do you do that? Well, you did that if you both had the same book that you learned from, right? You did that if you had the same collection, Q, that you chose to tell your stories from. So Matthew wants to preserve Mark's biography, but also wants to tell some stories that flesh things out, give you a beginning and an end. And Luke kind of wants to do the same thing. He wants to do it with a more Hellenistic or Greek perspective. But we have these two Gospels clearly written copying Mark and copying something. We don't know what it was, but we'll call it Q. And what we guess Q is just a collection of things. It isn't an ongoing story. It may be somebody who went around and talked to Christians and they remembered this story that their grandparents told them or whatever. But it becomes a thing that anchors Matthew and Luke. So we kind of have three different types of gospels. We have Mark, which was something written with the expectation that soon Jesus would be back. We have Matthew and Luke, written with the sense that, no, that's not going to happen soon. We need a fuller story, and we need a story that caters to our perspective, that makes sense for our fellow believers. This isn't written for people over the entire world. This is written for our congregation, whichever congregation the writer was part of. And then we have John, probably not written for his congregation, probably written in Ephesus. You've heard of Ephesus from Ephesians. Not written for the congregation at Ephesus, but written about a Jesus that's kind of emerging now after 60 years, 70 years, is emerging as something that John wants to capture and put down on paper, a sense of what the church is starting to think about. When Mark writes, there is no church. When John writes, there is a church. So there we have kind of capsulization of the four Gospels. Let me pause for a minute. Things on your mind about this? Besides you're saying, my God, this is kind of weird. Questions?
There's the Vinci Code, okay, which I'm not saying it's anything real, but they're meeting with the guy where he shows the woman the picture of Last Supper, and that's actually Mary Magdalene in the picture. And he says, well, she has a gospel, and so does this, and he says that. And there's the gospel of Mary Magdalene, there's the gospel of Mary, there's the gospel of all these other people. He said, I think something like, all these other people, they had gospels too.
That's right. There are probably 50 gospels. We haven't even discovered all the gospels yet. 1945, we discovered 8 or 10 in Egypt. So it's a testimony to the issue of where do you stop? Where do you finally say, enough is enough? We've got all these gospels. And that's kind of the second phase of this that we'll take a look at next week. How did they ever decide? But the other thing going on is that while some are concerned about the story of Jesus, others, and you see this starting in Paul's letters, but it gets really going in the year 100 or the year 120, we've got to have a way to organize these people. You know, you can be talking about being in love with Jesus, but you got to figure out how to live together. And don't we all know that story? That's the story of the church, essentially. And so we have things written as sort of, I don't know, not exactly testaments, but written as rule books. There's something that came out called the Didache, which was well distributed, and churches started to use it. You had to elect people to be leaders. You had to have a group of people to make decisions. Why don't we call them deacons? Or we call them elders, you know? And you had to have people that led the congregation. Why don't we call them priests? So by the year 100 or year 120, while we have writings about the founder of this faith, we also have necessary writings about how to administer these congregations, because as more and more congregations sprung up, there was more and more a need to unify. And when you take a look at the known world, how would you unify that known world with congregations stretching from West Africa, you know, up into France? It's just a huge, huge place where to get somewhere you either took a boat or you walked. And you certainly didn't call them up on the phone and say, how are you running? your local congregation. So we get a number of writings with how-tos and don't-dos and things like that. Keep in mind, by this point, Jerusalem is a wasteland. The Jews have fled. And it's against that sort of loss of its original story, the story of Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Nazareth. It's against the loss of that, these congregations and followers have to survive. They have to live and keep the story going. And of course, I think it's fair to say keeping the story going wasn't a lot of work for them. They were pretty enthusiastic, and they, of course, recruited like crazy, so these churches were growing, but they were not growing in Jewish territory. They were growing around the outside, and so the writings that we start to get are writings not so much trying to be authoritative about who Jesus was, but writings that are meant to encourage you. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene or the Gospel of Mary. These are sort of devotional pieces that local congregations sort of fall in love with. And so, I don't know, we have 100, 200 local congregations around the world, and it becomes clear that we're going to go off in many different ways all at once if we don't find some way to hold us together, for all of us to profess some of the same things. And you just have to think about how daunting that must have been. I mean, there was no postal service, there wasn't even any Pony Express. I mean, how are you going to exchange this information so folks are on the same page? Well, the reality is you probably aren't, because the world is very, very wide. So we have this compendium of stories, writings. They spring up everywhere. People are fiercely associated with the ones that they knew and read, and they are sure that there's anything that is spiritual and holy, it's the one we hear at our church on Sunday morning. We all have our favorites. And Lord knows how many favorites there were. We really have no idea. Authorship seems to be happening everywhere. And there is also a lack of what I call agency. What I mean by agency, there's a lack of authority about who is going to decide that the one at your church is much more authentic and valuable than yours. Yours is, no. The one you follow is heresy. It's just terrible stuff. So we're going to have George's group promote their scripture and not others. Who has the power to do that? There's just nobody. I mean, the original leaders, Peter's dead, Paul's dead, the disciples are all dead. There's nobody that knew those who knew Jesus. And the church then goes along in a kind of world of, if we're Greek speakers, we can talk to one another. If we travel to another community, we can communicate because we have a common language. And so that starts to give us a foot up on finding a way to organize this thing. We are Greek speakers. And what were the four Gospels? What language were they written in? Greek. So it turns out that while some wanted to focus on the Jews, they were all written in Greek. So no matter where you lived in the world, you could read these. Now there were other things that got written in other languages. And of course they didn't fare so well, but we start to find we have something in common. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about today, we have the troublers. We have the congregations with writings that simply we can't stand. They just don't sound right, they don't look right. These are clearly heretics. And of course, heretics aren't decided by someone in Rome saying you're a heretic and you're not. Heretics are decided by the local congregation about some of their neighbors that don't believe like they do. These are the heretics. But after a while, the heretics kind of come together and they start to hold certain things. And these are the things that finally the the good guys have to attack. There are heresies. One of the great heresies is a problem that you know and I know, and that is, who was Jesus? Was he human or divine? And so there are heresies about Jesus couldn't have been human, because if he was human, he would have been a sinner, and how can we have a sinner leading us? We have to have somebody of God. So Jesus wasn't a physical body. Jesus was spiritual. Somehow he is here, but he was here only in the form of a kind of sense about us, a sense in our congregation about the way we love one another. That's who Jesus is. Jesus is a spirit of love. So we get that problem, the physical versus the spiritual. That's one of our problems. Then we have another problem, and that is, how are we ever going to have a church if we have 4 gospels? Come on, how are we going to do that? We're going to have one gospel, and we're going to decide which it is. And Matthew tends to be ahead in the race at first. And there are some churches that say, we'll have one gospel, it's easier, we don't have any contradictions, we don't have Luke saying something that Matthew doesn't say, we'll have that gospel. Others say, no, wait a minute, we'll have Luke. And then others say, oh, here's the solution, we'll get somebody to combine them. We'll have one gospel, there'll be a little bit of Mark, a little Matthew, a little Luke, maybe a whole lot of John, because we kind of start to like John a lot. So we'll have a lot of John, but there'll be other pieces in it. That way nobody gets left out. How would you like that? And there are some folks that kind of say that, and others say, that's crazy. Can't do that. And then we have finally the great troubling belief that follows the church for 4 or 5 centuries. And that is the heresy of Gnosticism. And when Stephen talks about that next month, a lot of it will be the Nicene Creed is all about Gnosticism. It's all about correcting this heresy that infects the church. What is Gnosticism? Gnosticism is a belief that there is a secret knowledge, that only insiders are in on it, that it makes a difference between being a God-fearing person and being a sinner. This knowledge is very, very esoteric. You have to work at it. It's like you have to study for it. There is a lot of it. This knowledge, the reason you want to study it is because you can't be saved unless you know it. And so therefore it's pretty important stuff. It gets gathered together in writings and so forth. It promotes 2 worlds. There's kind of the world of heaven and there's the world of earth. The world of earth is the place where Adam dwelt, the fallen world, the world of imperfection and sin. So now you know what heaven is, right? Heaven is the world of perfection, of this special knowledge, of a spiritual kind of existence that would never, ever have anything to do with earth. So this is kind of neat and tidy until you say, well, what about Jesus? I mean, we say he walked on the earth, he was like us. No. Jesus couldn't have been like that. Just couldn't have been. How could Jesus have been from God and yet be human? That doesn't compute. So you have, this is just the beginning of Gnosticism, but you have these kind of heresies going on because these are real problems. These are real problems for the young church when they draw in people, let's say, that have not read the Gospel of Matthew. They start having these questions. Well, you have this person you follow, but he was broken and sinful just like I am. How in the world could you follow somebody that was so like us? That doesn't work. And you have that in a Hellenistic world in which that was the way the gods were. You know, heaven was filled with all these kind of deities that were very unlike humans. And this is part of what you're starting to get in Gnosticism. So the way they got around this problem of humans is the Gnostics would say that inside of you and you, there was this little spark. And this little spark was what we have to capture and build on. And if we can capture it, we can completely transform you. And then you are worthy of heaven. You have spiritual knowledge. You have this Gnostic information. So Jesus then becomes someone who brings the spark and deposits it on earth, deposits it in you, and if you study, and if you memorize, and if you answer all the questions right, you got it. So that sort of is not quite fair to Gnosticism, but it starts to get at the issue. And the issue then infects the church for hundreds of years, because Gnosticism is in its way a bit like Christianity. It's very flexible. It can find answers to things that you think, there's no way to explain this. Well, Christianity does that with some stuff. There's no way to explain it, you just take it on faith, right? Well, Gnosticism was able to do the same. So amongst the heresies, it was probably the chief heresy that the church fought for years. And let me stop there, take some questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Oh, come on. You know, any questions? Or maybe you're just so confounded that you couldn't quite. Okay, next week we'll begin with this wider world. We'll have a look at how Matthew and Luke got written with this Q, how that Q came somewhere from the wider world, and then how this wider world has to wrangle these couple of hundred churches into something that's got some order and organization and some chance of survival. And it's a 200-year story it's very political. Let's just put it that way. When you see it happening, you'll understand it in a minute. Thanks for having me.